Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan Ennis. This is Ukraine War frontline update analysis, update extra video. I just wanted to flesh out some discussion and analysis of whether the counteroffensive has been a success or whether it's a failure. Ideas around that. I am having electrical work done. My videos today are very much delayed. They're stop start. I'm interrupted by stuff all the time. So I do apologize if I lose any flow or if there's some background noise during the making of this. And I have to say before I start that my computer lags when I look at the map most of the time during this video. It's not too important because I'm just giving general evaluations and analyses, but I do apologize for that. So it does freeze a bit during this video. I will in future use my more powerful laptop to do mapping updates. Not that this is a mapping update, but yeah, just an upfront apology there. Right, so here's a good introduction. This is from Paul Krugman. There are dueling narratives about Ukraine right now. One says that it's a stalemate. The other, represented here by Mark Hartlin, and I shared that with you the other day, says that Ukraine is gradually winning a battle of artillery attrition and that Russian forces will eventually snap. Krugman goes on to say, those of us who aren't military experts can't judge which is right. Even actual experts may not have enough information to be sure. It's a really good point, actually. So there will be a lot of unnamed US military officials that mainstream media sources are relying on that won't have the requisite knowledge to make really accurate evaluations of how the counteroffensive is going. Krugman continues, one thing I've noticed, however, is that Ukraine optimists like Hartling and the Institute for the Study of War are generally making predictions on the record, while the stalemate narrative is generally coming from unnamed sources talking on background. Now, I think that is something I hadn't really thought of. That actually people who are willing to put their name on the record are those in the optimist camp, and those who aren't are in much more negative about what's going on. And I'm not quite sure what that tells you. Anyway, he continues, not dispositive, of course, but says something about who's willing to take the risk of being publicly proved wrong. It's not just Hartling, it's Lawrence Friedman, the ISW, other open source intelligence sources, and General Ben Hodges, former in charge of the European forces in Europe. These are credible sources. This war cannot be wished away. We have to we have to arm Ukraine to win, which means long-range artillery from USA, ATACMS, for example. I'm not sure it's as easy as that, but the general point is we need to give everything we can. Right, okay. So here's a map. We have what have we seen over the last 3 months? So initially we saw quite a lot of activity in the Bakhmut area, and indeed a little bit in the Avdiivka area, as well as three kind of sectors on the southern front in this Zaporizhia to Donetsk southern front. So the Velika Novosilka salient, the Tokmachka or Orikhiv sector, and here the Vasilivka sector. The Vasilivka sector has now gone quiet. It's been somewhat positional there. Robotna, there is more success, and Velika Novosilka, some success as well. I would say that we are starting to see some breakthroughs taking place in Robotna, and there's been some gains, of course, in Uruzhany, and now sort of each side to the east of Pryutne, and going down towards Starominivka. So there are various successes that are starting to happen. But at the same time, we have seen Bakhmut calm down. So there is still activity in the Klishchivka area, but sort of in Bakhmut itself and north of there, not a lot of activity at all. So what does that say? Well, it could represent an element of truth coming from some of these evaluations that we're seeing in the mainstream media, which fall into the kind of what you might call realist front, pessimist front, I don't know. but we're going to have a look at them at the moment. Shashank Joshi sort of dips into this New York Times article when he says American planners, or he's quoting, American planners have advised Ukraine to concentrate on the front driving toward Melitopol, Kyiv's top priority, and on punching through Russian minefields and other defenses, even if the Ukrainians lose more soldiers and equipment in the process. Right, let's go and look at this Times piece then, which does have quite a lot that is worthy of note, actually. But at other times, I think it is being sort of overly pessimistic and has the wrong idea of objectives. And actually, before we dip into this, let's talk about objectives. So I will be in danger of repeating myself here, but I think it is important to lay out the foundation. So when you're talking about something being good or bad, so actually this is morality as well. So with my philosopher's hat on, I would say morality is goal orientated, which means that it's all about the goal that you're working towards. With regard to evaluating whether something is good or bad or successful or failing, then it depends what your goal is, right? And then it depends what the metrics are that you are measuring your attainment of that goal. And these things will be different in different places along the front line and at different times. Okay, so right now, I think the main goal of the Ukrainians will be different here in Bakhmut than it is maybe down in these places. In Bakhmut, the primary goal, and sorry to repeat myself, primary goal is to fix the Russian troops here. The tertiary goal, so the third goal, is actually to take back territory here. That is ultimately what they want to do everywhere. But to use territory as a marker, as a metric for success right now, is problematic. And this, I'll return to that when we look at the New York Times analysis and what some of the officials are saying, because they are talking about it being a land bridge. They need to successfully get this land bridge, so that's a territorial gain. Actually, I think they've gone back to saying no. Our primary gain. Well, in Bakhmut, it's fixing Russian troops so that they can't be used elsewhere. Ideally, the secondary goal would be to attrit them, and the tertiary goal is to gain ground. In other places, their primary goal initially was to get territory. When you saw these attacks 3 months ago now, down in the south of Orikhiv and Malotokmachka, and they lost a bunch of stuff, and then they stopped and said, right, we can't lose that many troops and vehicles. This is too heavily mined, and the Russians have too much artillery to bring to bear. We don't have close air support, and we need to get rid of, therefore, the enemy air defenses, as well as attrit their artillery and other equipment as well, of course, radars, electronic warfare, so on and so forth. So right now, and for the last 2 months at least, the main objective for the whole of the South has been the attrition of artillery and air defense systems and electronic warfare systems. So let's call that general equipment attrition, right? They have also been doing probing little attacks that will be trying to find weaknesses in defensive lines, in mined areas, whilst also trying to clear mines as well, minefields. So they'll be doing a little bit of everything, but really, there's no point trying to take territory if in trying to take territory you get absolutely hammered by artillery and you lose troops and equipment. So this goes back to another metric of success. And I don't know if you remember, it was a Mick Ryan thread I went through with you, which talked about success and failure and how to measure success and failure. And there are all these different, I think he has 7 different ways of measuring them, but one of them is, and we know that the Ukrainians took this really seriously in Kherson. And once you understood that when they were trying to take back Kherson, one of their main goals wasn't actually territory, or it wasn't territory at the exclusion of everything else. One of their main goals was not to lose their own troops, and because they'd actually lost quite a few pieces of equipment and troops here by doing some failed like counters and maneuvers. So then it was like, right, we aren't going to take this really quickly and then cut off the Russians in such a way that we can absolutely destroy loads of their equipment and loads of their troops. So therefore, the attrition objective was not their main objective in Kherson. It was territory, but with not losing their own troops. So if you understood Kherson counteroffensive as having one of the main success metrics as not losing Ukrainian troops, then you understand why they did what they did, which was somewhat slower than people were imagining and allowing the Russians to get off there, but it enabled them to take Kherson with minimal casualties eventually after losing some, right? So it's trying to understand what the objectives are and then what the different metrics are for those objectives, and knowing that it will be different in different places and at different times. So and I say at different times because initially the Ukrainians, as I said, already did something and then they adapted and changed. And now they have different objectives with different metrics. Okay. So that is really important to bear in mind. And that's why you are seeing the Russians maybe doing quite well in certain areas up the north. The Ukrainians aren't concerned about territorial gain or loss, particularly up here. It's not particularly important. So if they can almost let the Russians have some victory up here in terms victory scare quotes in terms of what the Russians. Well, I think the Russians are actually attempting to get the Ukrainians to redivert attention up here. So in fact, the Russians' main objective here isn't territorial gain. That's like as an added bonus if they can get it right, and they can shout about that. But really, it's about fixing Ukrainian troops up here in the same way that Ukrainians' objective in Bakhmut is to fix Russian troops there. Now, if the Ukrainians can defend here just about enough without having to pull on their counteroffensive resources, then even if they lose some ground, they are successfully dealing with the issue in the Luhansk and Kharkiv oblasts. And here we have a calming down of the situation, and I think you've had resources moved away from Bakhmut to the southern front line, and the Ukrainians are now using kind of skeletal forces, if you like, just enough to hold and fix the Russians in place in Bakhmut, whilst also troubling them in Klishchivka and maybe taking some ground there or attriting them. But really, it's about fixing the Russians here, right? Now, with that in mind, with that primer in mind, let's go to the New York Times article. Ukraine's forces and firepower are misallocated, US officials say. And remember, these are unnamed sources. And it's therefore very easy to confirm, disconfirm, get any finer details on what their agenda might be and what their knowledge base might be. Okay. The main goal of the counteroffensive is to cut off Russian supply lines in southern Ukraine by severing the so-called land bridge between Russia and the occupied Crimean Peninsula. Okay, let's stop already. That is to say, the main objective is to create this land bridge. But I would split that down and say that is now not their main objective. That is the overarching main objective, but you can split that into smaller sub-objectives. And you can't get the overall objective until you get those sub-objectives sorted out. So you can't take territory until you have sorted out the equipment attrition. So I'd say their main objective is still the land bridge, but their more pressing objective, if you like, is attrition of equipment. Anyway, to continue. But instead of focusing on that, Ukrainian commanders have divided troops and firepower roughly equally between the east and the south, the US official said. Now, there might be some value in this, actually. That might be quite correct. So at the time, the Ukrainians Bakhmut was so big, in the news, and the Russians had shouted so much about taking it that actually they could do a counterattack around here and try and reverse that PR win for the Russians. It wasn't a huge PR win. They'd taken the best part of a year to almost take Bakhmut. The question is, did the Ukrainians up until maybe recently have too many troops accumulated here? And yet still, I think their objective there was more about fixing the Russian troops. So you could contest what the New York Times is saying here, or what the US officials are saying here, because actually, the more troops you put here, the more Russians you're fixing here, and the more Russians aren't here. So it's like, I'm not going to make this up. So say you had 20% more troops in this southern region, as the US officials are supposedly claiming they should. Say that you need 20% more troops here, and then you can overwhelm these defenses. But if you've had 20% more troops here, those 20% troops won't be up in Bakhmut, which means that there are 20% Russian troops that won't be up there, and they'll be down there. And in fact, so you may be talking about misallocating, but actually it by reallocating to there, the Russians will be able to reallocate. And so therefore it's just like, well, we're back to exactly where we started. And arguably could be in a worse position, depending on how that allocation looks. But do you get my point? It's not quite so simplistic as I think these US officials are saying. But hey, what do I know? I'm just some random, right? As a result, more Ukrainian forces are near Bakhmut and other cities in the east than are near Melitopol and Zaporizhia in the south, both far more strategically significant fronts, officials say. But yes, exactly the same as I said before. Yeah, they're there in order to fix the Russians up there, so the Russians aren't down in Melitopol and Zaporizhia. American planners have advised Ukraine to concentrate on a front driving toward Melitopol, Kyiv's top priority, and on punching through Russian minefields and other defenses, even if the Ukrainians lose more soldiers and equipment in the process. And this is a highly dubious position of a US official saying to the Ukrainians, I think you should sacrifice a load of your human beings and equipment here, just so you can punch through this area, these Russian defenses. And the Ukrainians saying, oh yeah, that's fair enough for you to say, but they are our human beings. And by the way, would you do that if you didn't have close air support? We don't have air superiority. We don't have air advantage. This is contested airspace, and the Russians have air advantage, and yet you are expecting us to do something that you wouldn't do yourself, right? So that's highly contentious, and then it goes back to, so if we don't have close air support, or if we don't have air supremacy, then we need to do what our air support would do, which is suppression of enemy air defenses, destruction of enemy air defenses, and flattening trenches with A-10 Warthogs or whatever. We need to now do that with our ranged artillery that has a range advantage over the Russians. So therefore, stop telling us that we're being too slow, because if you haven't given us airframes, then we have to do the airframes job in a much slower, more methodical way with our artillery and rocket systems. Again, I'm beginning to think these US officials are too simplistic in their evaluations here. I mean, there are some points to be taken from this, and I do wonder whether the Ukrainians have taken some on board and have reallocated some of their resources from other places to the south. Anyway, so the yes, only with a change of tactics and a dramatic move can the tempo of the counteroffensive change, said one US official, who, like the other dozen Western officials interviewed for this article, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. Another US official said that Ukrainians were too spread out and needed to consolidate their combat power in one place. Now, there is something to be said about this. If you remember some of Thomas Tyner's evaluations, or not evaluations, Tyner's discussions about how to break through the Russian lines, it was basically accumulate an absolute ton of stuff and punch through with a very narrow fist. So you can completely overwhelm the Russians in one area, and you will lose some stuff. But then once you punch through, you then can. It's like a dam breaking. You get in behind, and then wreak havoc on the Russian defenses by attacking them from behind, so on and so forth. So actually, whilst Thomas Tyner is still very positive about the counteroffensive, what he was suggesting before the counteroffensive is what some of these US officials are suggesting should be the tactics for or the kind of operational strategy for the Ukrainians. So there is definitely some something to take on board from what they're saying here. Now, nearly 3 months into the counteroffensive, the Ukrainians may be taking the advice to heart, especially as casualties continue to mount and Russia still holds an edge in troops and equipment. I'm not wholly sure that that's a fair analysis by the New York Times there, because I don't think they necessarily do have. Well, the edge in troops. I don't think that they've got low morale troops and generally poorly equipped, and they're using their elite forces in the bog standard defensive trenches and so on and so forth. There was some intercepts coming out over the last few days that seem to indicate that the Russians are indeed running out of tanks. I haven't played that to you, but you can go and check them out. I think Combat Veteran Reacts it does some analysis of one of the intercepts. You can go and check one of his recent videos out. But that I think is telling. That, and I've been talking about how a drop in tank losses it more likely indicates that the Russians don't have the tanks rather than the Ukrainians are unable to blow them up. They're unable to blow them up because the Russians are using fewer tanks because they don't have those tanks. Anyway, it goes on to talk about Zaluzhny getting together with is it Cavoli? Yeah, Christopher Cavoli, a US general, and Satoni Radakin, who's a British counterpart. He's an admiral. Here he is. I found this quite interesting. Admiral Radakin's role has been especially important and not widely appreciated until now, the official said. General Milley speaks to General Zaluzhny every week or so about strategy and Ukrainian military needs, but the Biden administration has prohibited senior US officers from visiting Ukraine for security reasons and to avoid increasing tensions with Moscow. But Britain, however, has imposed no such constraints. And Admiral Radakin, a polished officer who served 3 tours in Iraq, has developed close ties with his Ukrainian counterpart during multiple trips to the country. Well, that was a nice little nugget to glean from here. So American officials say that there are indications that Ukraine has started to shift some of its more seasoned combat forces from the east to the south, but even the most experienced units have been reconstituted a number of times after taking heavy casualties. These units rely on a shrinking cadre of senior commanders. Some platoons are mostly staffed by soldiers who have been wounded and returned to fight. So be interesting to see how accurate that is. There are some claims that the Russians too are having an issue with their sort of lower echelon of officers, and they are filling some of these roles with unseasoned kind of soldiers, basically. Ukraine has penetrated at least one layer of Russian defenses in the south in recent days and is increasing the pressure. US and Ukrainian officials said it is close to taking control of Robotne. Well, it has now, a village in the south that is near the next line of Russian defenses. Taking a village, Americans said, would be a good sign. But some analysts say the progress may be too little too late. The fighting is taking place on mostly flat, unforgiving terrain, which favors the defenders. The Russians are battling from concealed positions that Ukrainian soldiers often see only when they are feet away. Hours after Ukrainians clear a field of mines, the Russians sometimes fire another rocket that disperses more of them at the same location. Under American war doctrine, there is always a main effort to ensure that maximum resources go to a single front, even if supporting forces are fighting in other areas to hedge against failure or spread out enemy defenses. So this is again that kind of idea of punching through with a kind of narrow fist, if you like. Yeah. So anyway, to continue. American strategists say that keeping a small force near the destroyed city is justified to pin down Russian troops and prevent them from using it as a base for attack. Exactly. So, yeah, a small force is the point, though. But Ukraine has enough troops there to try to retake the area, a move that US officials say would lead to a large number of losses for little strategic gain. American officials have told Ukrainian leaders that they can secure the land around Bakhmut with far fewer troops and should reallocate forces to targets in the south. Ukrainian leaders have defended their strategy and distribution of forces, saying they are fighting effectively in both the east and south. The large number of troops is necessary to pressure Bakhmut and to defend against concerted Russian attacks in the country's northeast, they say. Ukrainian commanders are competing for resources and have their own ideas of where they can succeed. And I think that's some good old fashioned, discussion, argument, debate about, where troops are best assigned. And I although, what I've said I think is still, is broadly correct, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have said it. But there is an argument to say, actually, yeah, there are still too many forces up in Bakhmut and Ukrainian forces, and you can reallocate some of those, as I have stated. American officials' criticisms of Ukraine's counteroffensive are often cast through the lens of generations a generation of military officers who have never experienced a war of this scale and intensity. Moreover, American war doctrine has never been tested in an environment like Ukraine's, especially, this is me speaking, especially when they don't have air superiority. To continue, where Russian electronic warfare jams communication and GPS, and neither military has been able to achieve air superiority. Yeah. American officials said Ukraine has another month to 6 weeks before rainy conditions force a pause in the counteroffensive. Already in August, Ukraine has postponed at least one offensive because of the rain. Offensive drive. Ukraine also shifted its battlefield tactics. So I'm missing a bit. Its battlefield tactics then, returning to its old ways of wearing down Russian forces with artillery and long-range missiles instead of plunging into minefields under fire. In recent days, Ukraine has started tapping into its last strategic reserves, air mobile brigades intended to exploit any breakthrough. While fighting could continue for months, US and other Western officials say Ukraine's counteroffensive would not have enough decisive firepower to reclaim much of the 20% of the country that Russia occupies. There's something to be said about this, because actually I think about this quite a lot when I look at these places and I zoom in and you think, goodness me, how difficult it has it been for them to take Robotna, right? And this small village really there, and all these fields and all the minefields. And yet you kind of zoom out and you say, right, they've got to take Kopani, Rivne, Solodka Balka, Novopokrapivka, Verbove, Romanivska, and there's some big old trench lines around here. There's a huge amount of trenches around Ocheretuvate, and over here towards Polohi as well, and Shevchenkove. Huge entrenchments there. Then you got Tokmak itself. So, and then that's just that small area just south of Robotna. Well, actually, when you talk about 20% in the entire country of Ukraine, then that's this entire area. Think how much they need to do in order to take that. So the question is always, well, how much do the Russians have in order to defend? Will it be a dam that's breaking? Can we rely on that being the case? As mentioned here, no, not there. It is. I think it's this one here. Oh my goodness, no, I've lost it. Anyway, it's the idea that as possible it might be that the dam might break. It doesn't mean that it's probable, right? And that's likely to happen. It could happen, and it is plausible, and it's what we hope. But we just don't know what the Russian mentality is like, the morale, and just the sheer number of reserves they do or don't have. It looks like they are too thinned out. It looks like they're in trouble, but we don't know what the Russians might have up their sleeve. Anyway, that was the New York Times piece. I don't think there's anything else I'm going to share there with you. Now, let's go on and just go back to Shashank Joshi from The Economist, who says a couple of thoughts on debates over Ukraine's. Yeah, this is actually what I was talking about, offensive. One is that we have to distinguish between assessments of what is likely and assessments of what is possible. Russian lines could crack does not equal Russian lines are likely to crack. People are habitually talking past each other. Second, assessing that Ukraine is likely to break the land bridge in this offensive does not mean you have to favour a diplomatic settlement or territorial concessions. Is unlikely, sorry. So I think this is a really important point. If they fail to get this land bridge sorted, and there are some people saying they don't need to go all the way down to, say, Berdyansk, they can just approach Melitopol, and you get to somewhere like here. Let's look at distances then. So if you get to somewhere north of Melitopol, then that puts everywhere in HIMARS range that effectively makes this a land bridge. Because why do you want this to be a land bridge? Because you want to cut off supply of Russian forces, troops and supplies from one side to the other, from Crimea up to the southern Donetsk and Zaporizhia area, or vice versa. Well, you don't have to get all the way to the coast. You can get halfway to the coast and let HIMARS and multiple launch rocket systems do the rest. Okay, so and then next, oh yeah, and also if they don't manage to do that now, before, I don't know, autumn, for example, it's not like, oh, you failed to do that, right, we're going to have to go to Kremlin with our tails between our legs and start doing a diplomatic agreement to appease Putin and give half of the occupied territories away. No, it doesn't mean that. It means we haven't done it by that time. We'll try again in the next offensive. So I think that's a really important observation. So Joshi continues, it can also mean, while remaining open to Ukrainian successes over the coming 6 weeks, thinking now about how best to resource Ukraine in a war of attrition into 2024, and all sides, Ukrainian partners, avoiding finger pointing, but also facing up to and learning from errors and missteps. More kit is not the only answer. What, for example, does this mean for training programs over the next 18 months? And we can get back to discussions of the frustration of not being given airframes to support this kind of counteroffensive. Whether that was ever doable or not, I guess would be one for the history books. But it is certainly a frustration I think many of us share. Now, I know this video has already been half an hour in the making, but we really need to look at what Lawrence Freedman says here. So who is he? He's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London and an author, etc., etc. He's written a Substack piece that is right on point for this whole conversation. Ukraine's offensive, is it failing? So let's dip into some of this. I mean, I could read all of it, of course. The recent flurry of newspaper reports suggesting that the Ukrainian campaign has run into trouble began on August the 17th when the Washington Post quoted anonymous US officials lamenting that insufficient territory has been liberated and vital targets have yet to be taken. Of these, the city of Melitopol was highlighted as the gateway to Crimea, located at the intersection of two important highways and a railway line that allow Russia to move military personnel and equipment from the peninsula to the other occupied territories in southern Ukraine. This was followed by another piece 3 days later, continuing to the lament, observing that the, quote, counteroffensive shows signs of stalling. The Russians were far from crumbling, not only putting up fierce resistance, but even making offensive advances. So that was, not looking at things too positively for the Ukrainians. The timing of these stories was surprising. A number of analysts were cautious from the start about how easy it would be to break through Russian lines and the time it might take to make significant progress. This was my assessment from the 10th of June in the Sunday Times, he links. It was soon evident that the caution was warranted. The first moves in the offensive in early June had not gone well, but it was also evident that the Ukrainians had adjusted their tactics accordingly. This is the important part for me. As I and many others noted, hopes for dashing maneuvers were soon replaced by more realistic focus on small-scale engagements, eating away at Russian forward positions and logistic networks, using Ukraine's advantages in the quality if not the quantity of their artillery. The expectations of a decisive breakthrough over the coming months were soon swapped for the more realistic prospect of a campaign that would continue until the autumn, when it would need to wind down because of resource constraints, especially ammunition and boggier conditions. Right, so there are several things that one needs to take into account here. One is the temperature, the climate, the weather. Sorry. So as we get into the Rasputitsa season, you get really heavy rains and boggy conditions. That means you can't move mechanized equipment around. Okay, so that's a problem. So you might need to get things done by then. But also, the Ukrainians will be constrained by ammunition. I've talked about that already. They need millions of pieces of ammunition, ordnance manufactured a month, both for for tanks, for howitzers, and for mortars, and all the different calibers of those that are fired. But, and I talked about this the other day, which is that there are no time constraints for the war as a whole. So at least if you're looking at it in a small bubble of just the Ukraine with no consideration for anyone else in the world. I'm going to use some pretty crappy analogies again. So if I had a burglar that came around my house and forced his way into, or an armed robber even, forced his way into my house, and I'm fighting him off, and it's taken me half an hour wrestling with him, and I'm just getting him to the front door, and then he pushes me back, and then I'm pushing him back, and the police come along. It would be kind of weird if they stood off to the side and said, "Oh, by the way, Jono, you need to get that wrapped up by 9 o'clock tonight because we want the street to be a bit quiet. So you really need to get that burglar out of your house by 9 o'clock. Thank you very much." I'm not concerned by that. I'm fighting for my territorial integrity here. There's no time frame on that. I'm going to get this burglar out, whether it takes me 10 minutes or 10 hours or 10 days. That's what I need to do, and it will take as long as it takes for me to get this person out. And do you know what? It'd be great if I can have as much help as possible from as many people, many of my neighbors as possible. That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much. timeframes only seem to become pertinent when other variables are introduced. So, with regard to Ukraine, timeframes are important when you're talking about the American political elections, right, or war fatigue in terms of support for Ukraine from different nations, from like a political uh, surveying of the populations to a political surveying of the politicians, so on and so forth. Timeframes might be important for this kind of weaponry or that kind of, but in terms of what Ukraine are thinking in of their own activities and how they're approaching uh, the war themselves and the need to get Russia out of their territory, there is no time frame. We need to get them out. However long it takes us is however long it will take us. So there are these several ways of looking at that. Anyway, uh, let's go back to what this Substack piece has been saying. He comes on to discuss risk aversion, and this is something that was brought up in the New York Times article we've just gone through, but he dips into a few articles here. He says part of the negative assessment was a simple recognition that Russians had done a good job of constructing defenses that were hard to pass. But there was another part of the critique that caught my attention. The original Post article noted the casualties suffered by the Ukrainians during the early stages of the offensives, adding that, quote, joint war games conducted by the US, British, and Ukrainian militaries anticipated such losses, but envisioned Kyiv accepting the casualties as a cost of piercing through Russia's main defensive line, the US and Western officials said. He goes on to say the article then suggested that the Pentagon had recommended multiple times that Ukraine concentrate a large mass of forces on a single breakthrough point. This picked up on a debate that had been underway from early in the year when Kyiv decided to commit substantial forces to the defense of the eastern city of Bakhmut, despite its limited strategic relevance and the high human cost. Quote, the Ukrainians have for months poured tremendous resources into Bakhmut, including soldiers, ammunition, and time, but they have lost control of the city and have made only modest gains in capturing territory around it. And while the close in trench line fighting is different in Bakhmut from the problem of mines in the south, the focus had left some in the Biden administration concerned that overcommitting in the east may have eroded the potency of the counteroffensive in the south. And then he talks about similar sort of things in the Financial Times and the New York Times, as in just what I've been discussing from the New York Times. So he then says, how valid is this critique? First, there is a distinction between being risk averse and reckless. So risk averse is I don't want to take too many risks. I want to take things cautiously. And then the other opposite end of that is being reckless. The problem was not that Ukraine was unwilling to attempt company and battalion armored assaults, but that when it did so, Russian anti-tank capabilities just proved too strong. If they had been mounted on a larger scale, it is not clear that the gains would have been much greater, although the casualties would certainly have been higher. So think about those Malatok-Machka losses north of Robotna, where they lost a whole bunch of stuff. And then imagine that they did that with 3 times the amount of resources, right? Would they have made that much more of gain from having piled in all that more stuff? Well, it depends how you do it. If you're going to spread that sideways, then you're going to come across the same kind of minefields and against the same problems. If you're going to push into that same space with just waves and waves of that equipment, you might be able to break through, but it just depends how good the Russian defense would be and how many ATGMs and artillery pieces and so on and so forth. But it could just be you pile through there and the artillery can just keep on hitting you. Keep on hitting you. So the idea that you can punch through in this narrow fist is somewhat contingent upon how good the Russian artillery is and how long that can keep going. And arguably it can keep going a very long time. So that's why we've got to this adapted scenario whereby they're tricking the artillery so that can't happen. And I think that's sensible. Anyway, a concentrated force for a concerted push would have been spotted and likely caught by Russian artillery, and it would still have been held up by the minefields. The Americans have not recently undertaken an operation of this sort and would only do so with assets that the Ukrainians lack. This is absolutely true. So they would only do that with, with their superiority. Americans have never experienced a war of this scale and intensity. Certainly, in living memory for the people still fighting. The lessons here is not that the Ukrainians failed to achieve what the Americans might have hoped to achieve in similar circumstances, but that it was unrealistic to expect them to even try. Right? The Ukrainians reverted to smaller scale operations that they understood better and knew how to execute. The challenge now is to coordinate these more effectively so that there can be more concentration of force and fire. We go back to the New York Times article. It talks about they've gone back to this kind of Soviet era doctrine of attrition, artillery, blah blah blah. And it's not. It is not what is happening. Actually, what we've gone to is a kind of hybrid approach. I think of taking on NATO kind of doctrine and adapting it to the needs of the landscape here, which is the use of precision guided munitions, things like Excalibur, things like HIMARS, to strategically disable the Russian defense. Hitting artillery pieces to the point where they are losing 20, 30, sometimes even 40 pieces a day up and down the front line, but particularly in the south here, taking out logistics, taking out fuel depots, taking out logistics routes, bridges. Just this really, I think, highly successful Ukrainian phase here, where I get the sense that the net is closing. We've seen today the loss of an S-400, really high value battery, arguably, over here. We've seen bridges taken out. We've seen depots being blown up that have caused huge amounts of destruction and a loss of resources for the Russians. And then we have seen just this consistent degradation of the Russian artillery capability. And I think that's as I say, has been hugely successful. So I don't think that is reverting to any kind of Soviet style warfare. I just think it's a very clever use of what the Ukrainians do have in place of what they don't have, which are obviously airframes and the ordnance that they can use off those airframes. So anyway, continued here is the issue now is whether Ukraine should concentrate on more defensive operations in the east, given that it is going to be a stretch to retake Bakhmut and commit more forces to the south. Okay, so he's talking about this debate over risk aversion here, the extent of the commitment in the east. So that's one part. The third element of risk aversion is the accusation of risk aversion has normally been directed at Washington. It is now a standard critique of the Biden administration that while it has done a good job on maintaining alliance unity and providing Ukraine with substantial diplomatic, economic, and military assistance, when it comes to the capabilities that are most vital to current operations, artillery, ammunition, air defenses, the Pentagon's support has made all the difference. The criticism is mainly directed at capabilities that would have helped Ukraine strike targets well beyond the front lines, which have either been held back completely or seen allies making up the running, such as the UK with cruise missiles and now Denmark and Netherlands with F-16s, or have been belatedly authorized. The Ukrainians are still waiting for long-range army tactical and missile system ATACMS. This reluctance to hand over higher-end capabilities has been justified by concerns about provoking Russia into nuclear escalation, although this is no longer seen as a pressing concern, the same as it was last year. Critics argued that the risk was exaggerated and that Russia had already escalated in ways that was hurting the Ukrainians. And the fourth element about risk aversion is a casualty aversion, and it's featured highly in decisions on US force employment in recent decades, in part because of concerns that public opinion would not tolerate significant losses in those interventions when the most vital national interests were not at stake. And then he goes on to say, and I found this pretty interesting, I found one example of the US complaining about the risk aversion of an ally in a book I've been reading by James Conroy's about the January 1943 Casablanca Conference. This is when the Americans and British forged a common strategy for the Second World War. The British chiefs of staff were worried about the Americans, that they were too much in a rush to invade occupied France, and that without proper preparations, this could lead to carnage. American strategy, according to Conroy, was, quote, rooted in the bludgeoning style of Ulysses S. Grant. Americans won their wars with enormous wealth, industry, manpower, and hubris. Quote, they built a powerful army when the need arose, attacked the enemy's strength as quickly as possible, and took and inflicted casualties until he stopped struggling. Anything less was a distraction. Page 19. These attitudes die hard, says says the author Friedman here. So that is an interesting approach, I guess, to this counteroffensive, but also to Americans and their offensives, in the larger field of war. Anyway, Friedman goes on to say, unless the Ukrainian position became truly catastrophic, it's hard to see why Western governments would or should agree to an about turn. So this is talking about like what happens if it goes wrong for the Ukrainians. It's like, well, it could go wrong, but even if no, unless it went catastrophically wrong, then it's unlikely that the Western governments are going to do a volte face, really. Even if this offensive falters, Ukraine would still not be defeated. I think the worst case scenario is it takes longer than people think it will. That's really a problem. And it's what the ramifications of that might be. So if it takes longer than people think it would be, then they might lose support from the US, they might lose support from so on and so forth. But Friedman says the aid packages keep coming. The costs of Western countries of continuing support are manageable, especially as they are not actually doing the fighting. This situation cannot be compared with the disillusion that set in the Vietnam and Iraq as casualties mounted and a sense of futility grew. If they abandoned Ukraine after one setback, however serious, this would confirm the impression from Afghanistan that they are unreliable allies and would be hardly comfort to other countries, say Taiwan, that might hope for future support. So if we pull out of Ukraine now and stop helping them, then what does this say to any other country that seeks out NATO's help? Or all it does is it will push people over to the kind of BRICS hegemony rather than to the US NATO hegemony. There is now the issue of whether Donald Trump can win the presidency next year, but even if he did, his inauguration would not be until January 2025. And for the moment, all that we know about his Ukraine policy is that he believes that he could settle the war in no time at all. Republicans remain split, for sure. Some of the would-be presidential nominees want to cut back on support, but others in Congress are demanding that Biden give more to Ukraine. And he goes on, not too much more to say from this piece. I mean, there's so much you could say. We should not lose sight of the scale of Russian losses thus far and the failure of its own recent offensives. It has been showing signs of stress, but the army has not given up, and it manages occasional mini offensives while missile and drone strikes hurt the Ukrainians economically and socially as well as militarily. Russia's economy is not in great shape, but nor is it facing a chronic crisis. I don't know. Some part of me thinks that actually the Russian economy is pretty much in quite a bit of trouble, but we shall see. So even if the Ukrainian offensive prospered, there could be no guarantee of its political effect. And he goes on to say that Russia is not comparable to 1945, is not facing an existential challenge. One thing I would say to that is possibly Putin is facing an existential challenge. So if things don't go well here, it's not like Russia would cease to exist. It's not like Ukraine facing an existential challenge. Literally, if Ukraine do not prevail, Ukraine will cease to exist. Yeah, effectively, or at least meaningfully, it would lose, Crimea and the Donbass, and then that would just be a permission for it to be chipped away and chipped away until it's part of the kind of Russian Empire. So this is an existential challenge for Ukraine, but it's not arguably for Russia. However, I think it is for Putin, because if there is no great success for the Russians, which there won't be, then Putin is in trouble. So I think that there's a meaningful distinction to be made there, and that since it's Putin that's making the overarching decisions, or he's ultimately responsible and is the ultimate decision maker, then if he feels he's facing an existential crisis, then you know that may have some impact on decisions that are made. The conclusion here is this is why the decision to send F-16s to Ukraine is important. It will certainly not help with the current offensive, so unlikely they'll be flying much before next summer, but for that very reason, they are signal understanding of the potential length of this war. So there's no point giving them these jets and training them on the jets if we don't understand this war is going to go on. Right? It's not just about giving them jets off so that after the war is over, they can use F-16s. It's like, yeah, we're going to give you these and you can use them next March, which means that we expect you to still be needing to use them next March. And that's an important, I think, message to take from this. And I think Friedman's right in pointing that out. That is also why it's essential to step up production of ammunition and other war material. Absolutely agreed. If it is likely that fighting will continue well into the next year, then that should be reflected in Ukrainian strategy. Grumbles about slow progress should not lead to pressure to push harder than is feasible or prudent during the current offensive. I think what the Ukrainians are doing now is right. I think they're going at the right speed now in terms of attriting the Russians to a point where it then becomes easier for the Ukrainians to take territory. And don't pressure the Ukrainians to push harder than it's feasible or prudent during the current offensive. I really think that is the key sentence to this whole piece and basically this whole video. The aim should be to get in as good a position as possible for the coming stages of the war, and also to think about how best to sustain and develop capabilities for these stages. Whether Ukrainian forces do well or badly in the coming months, it will still be essential to think long term. And this goes back to what I said in one of my earlier videos today, which is the tortoise versus the hare. And I think the tortoise approach is definitely the best approach, especially going back to what I was saying earlier, when your metrics are not to lose as many troops as possible. The hare might bound away and be well in the lead and then get shot 3/4 of the way through the race. If the tortoise finishes the race alive, then that's pretty important, right? You're winning on account of being alive. And so, yeah, you can send Ukrainian troops and equipment into these really heavily defended areas and try and overrun them massively, but it might not be the best option. It might be better to be the tortoise and sit and say, right, we're not going to use up all this equipment, but what we are going to do is use up an awful lot of ranged ammunition and hammer the Russians into a position where they have no artillery left. They've got a severe lack of tanks, AFVs, and air defense systems, and and electronic warfare systems and ISR systems. And once that is the case, once that degradation is pretty terminal, then we can move forward. Then we can start thinking about becoming the hare. Tortoise first, hare later. And that, my friends, is almost the end of the video. We move forward. As for slow or not, do you know the exact deadlines that were set by the command? Says Budanov. Good point. And when you look at things like this, so this is Romanov, a pro-Russian mill blogger and journalist working on the front lines. This is no reporting Romanov saying what kind of expletive is happening right now in the Kherson direction. Interaction, reaction speed, it is all completely absent. The enemy launches boats along the Dnipro River, is making rotations, lands deep reconnaissance groups. There are simply no words. In other words, the Ukrainians have created a situation where the attrition has meant that the Russians are unable to do counter battery activity. They are unable to interact, to react, and they are completely absent from defense. And that allows the Ukrainians to make rotations, land DRGs, and do things with impunity. Arguably, obviously, it's not quite as simple as that, but that, just when you hear comments like that, and when you see the torrents of complaints from the Russians that they have no counter battery capability, then you understand that the metrics of success would indicate the metrics I would be using, which is those kind of things: counter battery, air defense capability. I think the Ukrainians are succeeding. It's not as quick as one might have hoped for, but this more realistic understanding and an adaptation that took place after the losses south of Malotokmachka lead me to be quietly confident that everything is happening in about a decent way as it could, given what the challenges are. And the only worry I have is people outside of Ukraine. Is people in like the US government, other governments in Europe. I'm fairly confident the UK will stay pretty consistent, to be honest. Even if we have an exchange to the Labour government, all the indications are that UK are actually fairly stable there with support for Ukraine. But certain other countries, that's not definitely the case. So it is these external issues that we have to worry about. But internally, as long as Ukraine still has access to ammunition and equipment, then the time constraints are less important to me, as maybe